Three variations on a constructivist theme. One view of meaningful learning that we have described, Jean Piaget's, holds that it is the natural result of an intrinsic drive to resolve inconsistencies and contradictions, that is, always to have a view of the world that makes sense in the light of what we currently know. One variation of the constructivism, cognitive constructivism, is an outgrowth of Piaget's ideas because it focuses on the cognitive processes that take place within individuals. In other words, an individual's conception of the truth of some matter, for example, that both birds and airplanes can fly because they use the same aeronautical principles, is based on her ability, with guidance, to assimilate information effectively into existing schemes and develop new schemes and operations. The process Piaget called accommodation, in response to novel or discrepant ideas. The constructivist variation, known as social constructivism, holds that meaningful learning occurs when people are explicitly taught how to use the psychological tools of their culture, such as language, mathematics, and approaches to problem solving, and are then given the opportunity to use these tools in authentic real-life activities to create a common or shared understanding of some phenomenon. Students are encouraged to engage in open-ended discussion with peers and teachers about such things as the meaning of terms and procedures, the relationships among ideas, and the applicability of knowledge to specific contexts. This process is often referred to by social constructivists as negotiating meaning. This view has its roots in the writings of such individuals as the psychologist Lev Vygotsky and the educational philosopher John Dewey. Social constructivism has also given rise to an increasing focus by researchers on how culture and history influence people's thoughts and actions as they engage with others and with their environment. A framework that guides this focus is called Cultural Historical Activity Theory, or CHAT for short. CHAT provides a way of analyzing and understanding activity in complex real-life situations. Cultural Historical Activity Theory. For example, Lisa Yamagata-Lynch used activity systems analysis to investigate an effort to integrate technology into a school district in hopes that increased use of technology would enhance student learning. The analysis of the activities of individual teachers, teacher groups, technology staff in the school and the district, and the activities in a professional development program called Yamagata-Lynch to observe how the activities of various individuals and groups interacted. I said called. A professional development program allowed Yamagata-Lynch to observe how the activities of various individuals and groups interacted. By using activity systems analysis, she was able to identify obstacles to attaining the goal of technology integration and the tensions that were created as people in various roles work toward the goal. Some tensions can contribute positively to attaining the goal. Cultural historical activity theory evolved from the social constructivism of Vygotsky. As CHAT has evolved, the importance of culture and one's history within a culture have been brought into clearer focus by the third lens through which we can view the constructivist view of meaningful learning. The third variation on the constructivist theme is referred to as critical constructivism. As we discussed in Chapter 5, Addressing Cultural and Socioeconomic Diversity, two important factors that distinguish one culture from another are ethnicity and social class. We learned also that cultural differences can mean differences in communication patterns that lead to misunderstandings among students and between students and teachers. Finally, we learned that teacher expectations can influence how students perform in school. Critical constructivism focuses on the social aspects of learning environments that teachers create in their classrooms, whether those environments perpetuate cultural misconceptions. For example, children from lower socioeconomic groups do not have sufficient prior knowledge to construct knowledge, and how learners' cultural backgrounds influence how they interact with others and with the content they are being asked to learn. Although the cognitive, social, and critical constructivist perspectives emphasize different aspects of learning, they are not incompatible. The cognitive approach does not deny the value of learning in group activities nor the influence of one's cultural background. The social approach does not deny the value of working independently of others. And the critical approach acknowledges that cognitive processing and social negotiation are key to constructing knowledge. As one constructivist observed, learning is an act of both individual interpretation and negotiation with other individuals. As we learned in Chapter 5, individual interpretation and negotiation with others are influenced by the cultural perspectives. Consider, for example, musicians in an orchestra. They practice both in a group and by themselves because some things are best learned in isolation. In other words, aspects of culture, or for example, aspects of technique such as breathing, fingering, or bowing, and others are best learned as part of the orchestra. For example, discussing from the perspective of their own cultural experiences how various techniques best express the composer's intent. All three variations on the constructivist theme assume that learning is an active process that is student-centered in the sense that, with the teacher's help, learners select and transform information, construct hypotheses, and make decisions. Conditions that foster constructivist learning. The fostering conditions that constructivists typically mention include a cognitive apprenticeship between student and teacher, a use of realistic problems and conditions, and an emphasis on mutual perspectives. Cognitive apprenticeship. The first condition, that of a cognitive apprenticeship, was illustrated in Chapter 9 on social cognitive theory when we described the reciprocal teaching program of Anna-Marie Palanksar and Anne Brown. Its main feature is that the teacher models a cognitive process that students are to learn and then gradually turns responsibility for executing the process over to students as they become more skilled. As you may recall from our earlier discussions in Chapter 2, for example, providing such environmental supports as modeling, hints, leading questions and suggestions, and then gradually removing them as the learner demonstrates increased competence, is called scaffolding. Cognitive apprenticeships also occur in less formal circumstances, as when a child joins an existing peer group, such as a play group. At first mostly watches the other children, what the other children do, and then gradually, with little explicit direction from the others, participates in one or more of the aspects of the task. Situated learning. In the second condition, often called situated learning or situated cognition, students are given learning tasks set in realistic contexts. A realistic context is one in which students must solve a meaningful problem by using a variety of skills and information. The rationale for this condition is twofold. Learning is more likely to be meaningful when it is embedded in a realistic context. And it's meaningful, it means related to previously learned knowledge and skills. Traditional forms of classroom learning and instruction, which are largely decontextualized in the sense that what students learn is relevant only to taking tests and performing other classroom tasks, leads to a condition that has been referred to as inert knowledge. That is, students fail to use what they learned earlier, such as mathematical procedures, to solve either real-life problems, such as calculating the square footage of the walls of a room to determine how many rolls of wallpaper to buy, or other school-related problems because they don't see any relationship between the two. But as we point out later in this chapter, when we discuss transfer of learning, some have argued that too strong an emphasis on situated cognition can make it difficult for students to see how to apply prior knowledge. Although ample research evidence exists to support the principle of situated learning, we can make the case for it even more persuasively by citing the experiences of successful teachers. Bill Smoot, whose interviews of award-winning teachers we mentioned in chapters 1 and 2, found that virtually all of these teachers made extensive use of situated learning. Examples include growing wheat and going through all the steps involved to turn it into bread, a project that addressed state standards for science, math, and social studies, turning raw wool into clothing, performing Shakespeare's Macbeth from memory, using the Japanese paper folding technique of origami as a way to understand various shapes, such as parabolas, and having students do a dance that mimics the cell dividing process of mitosis. As one teacher said, when projects are designed carefully and when they have rigorous components, they'll do a much better job in preparing kids even for the tests they have to take, and certainly a better job in preparing them for life. As an example of situated learning, baseball can be used as a vehicle for middle school or high school students to apply aspects of science, mathematics, and sociology. Students can be asked to use their knowledge of physics to explain how pitchers are able to make the ball curve left or right, or drop down as it approaches home plate. They could be asked to use their mathematical skills to figure out how far home runs travel. They could also be asked to read about the Negro Leagues and Jackie Robinson and discuss why it took until the late 1940s for Major League Baseball to begin integration. A more formal way of implementing situated learning is to use problem-based learning, PBL. Unlike a traditional approach to instruction in which students first learn a body of knowledge and then use that knowledge to solve problems, PBL presents students with complex, authentic problems, such as creating a water management plan for the desert Southwest, and requires them to identify and locate the information they need to solve the problem. In other words, students decide what they need to know to solve the problem. Although a considerable amount of research supports PBL, we would like to briefly mention a recent study for two reasons. First, it was done in middle school classrooms under realistic conditions. Second, the non-PBL condition, lecture discussion, was designed to be a high-quality competitor to PBL. In other words, these researchers could hardly be accused of stacking the deck in favor of PBL. The details of this experiment are quite interesting, and we encourage you to read it for yourself, even though it was published by an academic journal. We think you'll be able to follow what they did and why. You may even get some ideas for using PBL in your classroom. 9 weeks after either PBL or lecture discussion, students were tested for their comprehension of basic concepts and their ability to apply these concepts to a new problem. Students exposed to the problem-solving approach gave more basic and elaborated explanations of concepts, the comprehension test, than did students who were taught using a learning discussion format. The PBL students also scored quite a bit higher on the application test. This is an example of what we refer to later in this chapter as FAR transfer. The reason why PBL produces these results is not hard to understand. It does a better job than even high-quality lecture discussion of motivating students, stimulating them to activate relevant prior knowledge, and prompting them to meaningfully elaborate and store the lesson's content for future use. Multiple perspectives. The third condition that fosters constructivism is students viewing ideas and problems from multiple perspectives. The rationale, again, is twofold. Most of life's problems are multifaceted, and the knowledge base of experts is a network of interrelated ideas. The complex process of becoming an effective teacher is a good example of the need for multiple perspectives, including the perspectives of other teachers. As we mentioned at the beginning of the book, being an effective teacher requires the mastery of many skills and disciplines so that classroom problems can be analyzed and attacked from several perspectives. The following section provides an example of a constructivist-oriented teaching lesson, and Table 10.1 notes the major characteristics of a constructivist classroom. An example of constructivist teaching. A fifth grade teacher wanted his students to understand that the mathematical concept of pi expresses the relationship between the circumference of a circle and its diameter. On the first day of school, he gave students writing tablets divided into 3 columns. He told them that over the next 3 weeks they were to identify circular objects of all sizes outside of school and measure how many inches each one was across its center and around its perimeter. He purposely avoided using the terms diameter and circumference at this point. The first measurement was to be recorded in the first column of the tablet, and the second measurement in the second column. Over the next 3 weeks, the students measured all manner of round things, such as coins, tires, and dishes, all the time wondering why they were doing this project and what the teacher's explanation would be. When the class met on the day of the project's deadline, the students were both surprised and disappointed that the teacher did not offer an explanation. Instead, he had the students look over their 2 columns of numbers and said, "Now tell me what you can see that is interesting about these 2 sets of numbers." Gradually, the students noticed that the measurements of the circumference were always larger than the measurements of the diameter. He then asked, "How much bigger are the numbers in the second column, the distance around the circle, in relation to the numbers in the first column, the distance across the circle?" Once again, students wondered when the teacher would simply tell them the answer. But with a bit of coaxing, students began to guess until one girl realized that the answer to the question could be gained by dividing the larger number by the smaller one. The students did so, recorded their answers in the third column of their tablet, and were astounded to realize that the answer was always the same, 3.14159, regardless of the size of the circles. In a much more meaningful way than would have occurred had the students simply memorized the fact that pi is the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter, the students learned, as one put it, no matter how big a circle is, the distance around it is always a little more than 3 times the distance across it. They also learned that discovering ideas is fun, and that mathematics has a basis in the real world. This approach to teaching has much in common with an increasingly popular practice called flipping the classroom. The name refers to the fact that it is, in a traditional classroom, the teacher transmits basic information and then assigns problem-solving exercises, writing assignments, or other applied tasks for the student to work on at home. Whereas in a flipped classroom, the opposite sequence occurs. Students do their basic reading and practice exercises at home, and use class time to discuss concepts, solve problems, or work on projects. You can learn more about this approach to teaching by visiting the website for the Flipped Learning Network. On this website, you can also join an online community of educators who have flipped their classrooms, read and reply to posts, and view videos of how teachers use this technique to teach specific lessons. Characteristics of a constructivist classroom. Teaching and learning start from a student's current understanding of a subject. Therefore, the teacher needs to determine what students currently know and what relevant experiences they have had with key topics. Teachers help students create realistic learning experiences that will lead students to elaborate on and restructure current knowledge. Teachers believe that meaningful learning involves discovering, questioning, analyzing, synthesizing, and evaluating information. Students frequently engage in complex, meaningful, problem-based activities whose content and goals are negotiated with the teacher. Students have frequent opportunities to debate and discuss substantive issues. The primary goal of instruction is for students to learn to think for themselves. Consequently, teachers use a variety of indirect teaching methods, such as modeling the thinking processes they want students to use, providing prompts, probes, and suggestions, providing heuristics, a topic discussed later in this chapter, and using technology to organize and represent information. Students engage in such high-level cognitive processes as explaining ideas, interpreting texts, predicting phenomena, and constructing arguments based on evidence. In addition to assessing student learning with written exams, teachers also require students to write research reports, make oral presentations, build models, and engage in problem-solving activities. Student progress and the effectiveness of the learning environment is assessed continually rather than just at the end of a unit and the end of a semester. Subject matter disciplines and their knowledge bases are seen as continually undergoing revision. Putting constructivism in perspective. Although constructivism has much to offer teachers, like any other theory, it does have its limitations, and there may be problems with its implementation. Here are a few constructivism's drawbacks you should keep in mind. Because of constructivism's emphasis on guiding rather than telling, accepting different perspectives on issues and solutions to problems, modifying previous conceptions in the light of new information, and creating an atmosphere that encourages active participation, it is almost impossible to create highly detailed lesson plans. Much of what teachers do depends on how students respond. Teaching from this perspective will place a premium on your teacher as artist abilities. Teaching from a constructivist perspective is more time-consuming and places higher demands on learners as compared with the typical lecture format. Constructivism is not the only orientation to learning and teaching that you will ever need, nor is any other theory, for that matter. You need to know which theory or approach best fits with which purposes and circumstances you're using. Sometimes memorization of factual information is essential, and sometimes an instructional objective can be accomplished more efficiently and just as effectively with a clear and well-organized lecture. The extent to which teachers engage in constructivist teaching practices is determined in large part by how completely they accept its underlying principles. For example, knowledge is temporary. Knowledge is the result of discussions among students and between students and the teacher. Students have input into the curriculum. Learning is grounded in real-life tasks and settings to make it relevant to students' lives. Teachers who believe that they and not the student should decide what gets learned and how that their primary responsibility is to prepare students for high-stakes tests are less likely to use a constructivist approach. Assuming you do accept some constructivist principles and that you acknowledge that there is a beneficial role for instructional support within constructivist classrooms, there are many techniques you can use to foster meaningful learning within a constructivist framework. Several computer-based approaches are described at the end of this chapter. One technique that does not rely on computer technology but that is particularly well suited to developing, comparing, and understanding different points of view is the classroom discussion. Because this format also allows students to deal with realistic problems that are often complex and ambiguous and to exercise cognitive skills taught by the teacher, it is an excellent general-purpose method for helping students construct a meaningful knowledge base. It is also an effective way to improve the quality of students' writing. A study of discussion-based approaches to literature instruction in middle and high school classrooms involving almost 1,000 students found that higher levels of discussion-based instruction about reading assignments were associated with more abstract and elaborated reports, analyses, and essays based on the readings. Let's turn our attention to some specific suggestions for teaching that describe how to use discussion and other techniques to emphasize meaningful learning in your classroom. Pause and reflect. Can you recall a class in which the instructor used constructivist techniques? What did the instructor do? How did you react? Was the learning outcome more meaningful than for other classes?